welcome everybody to this launch meeting of the St. Olave's Book Club. We're delighted to have everybody here to start our reading, to kick off our reading this summer. This summer we've chosen to read the national bestseller Gutter Child. And it's a book that, while it is a work of fiction, is also one that we hope is going to spark some good conversation around real issues in our world. And so I will leave it to the author, to J.L. Richardson, to tell us more about what the book is about. We are delighted, absolutely delighted, to have her with us today as a special treat to introduce her work, to do a reading for us. And Deborah Dundas is going to be interviewing her for us. So before we get started, I am just going to open with a prayer. Let us pray. O God, who hast taught us something of thy truth, teach us more, we pray thee. When our minds are confused, direct them. When they are obstinate, win them. When they are filled with thoughts of self, fill them with thoughts of thee. And at all times, give us a humble and teachable spirit. For Jesus Christ's sake. Amen. So with that, I will turn it over to Deborah Dundas.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And I'm glad everybody is popping in person by person. And JL, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'll give a little introduction to the multi-talented JL. She's the founder of the Festival of Literary Diversity, which runs in Brampton every year in May. The festival highlights underrepresented voices and helps new writers to tell their stories through workshops and just creating a community. It's been so successful, she's branched out to include a children's festival in the fall, and she's getting kids to help tell their stories and to learn how to tell their stories and giving them a voice too. She's got a deep commitment to amplifying and encouraging stories. And
one package, I think,
whoops.
Okay, yeah, it's hard.
There we are. So she's got a deep commitment to amplifying and encouraging stories and creating dialogue and getting people talking and getting different people together. It's wonderful to see what she does in Fold, and I think a lot of you might want to go to some of the events when it comes out, when it comes up again in May, and even when it comes up in September. It was also one of the first festivals in the country to pivot to online offerings when COVID-19 hit. Besides doing all of that, JL is also a writer. She wrote a memoir titled The Stone Thrower and a children's book, both about her father, CFL player Chuck Ely. Now, for this book, she's turned to fiction for Gutter Child, and she's here to talk about it with us today. JL, welcome.
Hey, Deb, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. I'm really pumped to see you here. I mean, we've spoken about this book before, and I'm excited to hear what's happened since we spoke about it when it first came out in January. And there's been so much reaction and so much other stuff since. But how about before we get into that, you start off with a reading, if you don't mind, to give everyone a sense of your voice and the voice of the book.
Okay.
Awesome.
So fair warning, I am in my car. In order to find Wi-Fi where I was vacationing, I had to drive a little bit. So I'm navigating the phone and reading it from my iPad. And usually I have like a really fancy setup in my office. So you guys are getting like real organic me. So I'm going to read, because I know many of you, this is just the startup to reading it. So I thought I would read the first chapter, which is about 7 minutes. And so I'll do that. And then it'll give those of you who haven't started it a bit of a teaser. And those of you who have, maybe just a little bit of a different take on what you read already. The driver looks in my direction full of worry. Her lips are red, glossy, and pouted, and there's a crease in her forehead like she's the one with problems, not me. I stare out the window, wishing I could go back and put my old life back together, which is impossible, I know. So here I am instead, hours away from the only home I've ever known, and driving up a long gravel road through a tunnel of trees with branches that reach down like fingers, hungry for touch. This is Livingstone Academy, Miss Femia says, as we pull up to a grand white house with black shutters and a door that's green like a swamp. The car slows to a stop under a droopy willow, and I step out in what feels like a whole different world. I take one deep breath and close my eyes, and when I open them again, Miss Femia is standing in front of me with her tight bun and waxy mouth. She takes my hand in hers, rubbing my scar with her thumb, the hideous X on the back of my right hand that's ugly and raw. She sighs, and I wonder if it's sadness in her eyes, because it's hard to tell with mainlanders. Pity looks very much the same. I know this wasn't the plan, she says, but let's make the most of it, hey? Her voice is high and hopeful, and I hate the way it sounds, like forgetting the life I had. Like forgetting the life I had is my best option, like that's even possible. I really think you might like it here. I think your mother would really like this place, she says. I want to tell her that what mother would probably like is to be living instead of dead, to be back home with me instead of wherever it is she is now. But Miss Femia doesn't have children, and people without children always share silly bits of wisdom, like it will all go to waste if they don't. Yes, let's make the most of it, I say, turning up the corners of my mouth as high as I can manage, which isn't much. You can do this, Elamina, she says, wrapping her fingers around the doorknob, holding the swamp-colored door with her back. You can find happiness here. But happiness is something a kid like me can't afford to hold out for. The main entrance of Livingstone Academy is large and impressive, with tall columns and a wide carpeted stairwell that curves like a bow. Framed pictures of open landscapes and wide fields hang on brightly lit walls. At least it's not the gutter, I try to tell myself, as I turn and take it all in. Miss Femia, a man says, emerging from a hallway in a sharp tan suit, followed by a girl in a gray dress with a crisp white shirt underneath. The tall man with slick brown hair takes large steps across the room to greet us, kissing Miss Femia on the cheek and smiling down at me after. I stare back with wide eyes because, other than mother, no mainlander has ever looked at me this way, like they're actually pleased that I've arrived. Elamina, it's a tremendous honor to have you here at Livingstone Academy. I'm Headmaster Samuel J. Gregors, but Mr. Gregors will do just fine. He smiles and pauses for a moment, raising his chin in a way that makes me wonder if I'm expected to curtsy or applaud. While the circumstances that brought you here are less than ideal, I believe that Livingstone is exactly where you need to be, he says. Elamina, I sincerely believe that here in our tidy little academy, you'll find a home that propels you into an excellent future. He looks down at the girl in the gray dress whose hair is pulled into two round ponytails. Her skin is like mine, the color of oak trees and coconuts, as mother would say whenever she rubbed lotion onto my skin that smelled like spring rain. This is Josephine. She's one of our best students, he says, nodding in Josephine's direction as she takes a step forward, so we're close enough to touch. Josephine tilts her head, taking in my shaved head and raising one eyebrow. Mother started shaving my head when I was 5 years old because I had curls that refused to submit to her, hair that grew out instead of down. It's impossible to deal with. There's just nothing else I can do, she said, lifting me onto a tall stool where a pair of scissors lay resting on the countertop. She cut one messy ponytail, and when I gasped, she cut the other one quickly before grabbing a razor to take the rest. When she was done, when tiny black curls were scattered around her like feathers, she held my face between her held my face between her hands, tilting me this way and that, marveling at the richness of my skin held in her moon-colored palms. She smiled, like she was proud of the result, the smoothness, the even shape, how clean I looked. Perfect, she said. You look perfect, Elamina, a beautiful ebony goddess. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell, and I believed every word she said. You are perfect, beautiful, a goddess. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize. I saw a head that was naked and shorn like a bird born too soon, one that would never grow up and fly. And I knew that she had lied. You made me ugly, I yelled. And when I said those words again, shrill and loud, she called me vain and selfish. Elamina, Miss Femia says, placing one hand on my shoulders. Mr. Gregors just asked you a question, dear. I look up, my heart racing wildly like I've just been caught doing wrong. I'm sorry, sir. Never you mind. It was a long drive, he says, waving one hand in my direction like it doesn't matter at all. Josephine will take care of you today, and I'll meet you tomorrow after breakfast, after you've had some rest. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Don't be sorry, and don't be late, he says, pointing in my direction. It's a basic tenet of the work we do here to always be on time. I consider tardiness a sign of disrespect. Let's not get off to a bad start. Yes, sir. Josephine, show her around and do it proper, he says. No shortcuts, leave nothing out. Get her a uniform and be sure to take her to Nurse Gretchen. I want her to be ready to go when I meet her tomorrow. I'll have Violet inform Miss Darling that she'll be away for the duration of the day. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, Josephine says, nodding her head. Miss Femia moves closer, placing her hands on my shoulders and opening her red mouth like she's going to say something. But when she looks back at Mr. Gregors and Josephine, she presses her lips back together like now is not the right time. Miss Femia, I say, hoping she'll reconsider and say what's on her mind. It's not important, she says. You've got enough to worry about right now, Elamina. Go on with Josephine, get settled in. I'll swing by another time. She wraps her arms around me, and I don't squeeze back or cry. But when Miss Femia whispers in my ear, you'll be fine, I feel a stick in my throat that hurts so bad it makes it hard to swallow, like a knife cutting from the inside. I'll see you soon, she says. But somehow, I know this is a lie. Josephine leads me down a long hall with high curved ceilings, our footsteps clicking against the floors. When she reaches the tall set of doors at the end of the hallway, she places her palms on the brass panels and turns towards me, the X's on both of her hands standing tall. For a moment, I'm not sure I'm breathing at all. You ready? She says. But I don't answer. I just stare and follow her slowly through the doors, feeling somewhere deep in my gut that this is all wrong. I should turn and run. The dining hall is filled with long tables and wood chairs. It reeks of fried meat and steamed vegetables, and when we enter the room, students in matching gray uniforms turn and stare. But I just look down at all of the hands that look just like Josephine's, 2 scars instead of 1, like mine. I stop, and when Josephine turns to me, I whisper the only words I can manage, my throat still thick and tight. I don't belong here. I'm not a gutter child, I say. But Josephine just hands me a tray and shakes her head like I've got a lot to learn. That's the chapter 1.
Thank you. It's great to hear your voice and to hear the beginnings of the story. Now, what I want to say to everybody listening is, if you have a question for JL, please put it in the chat at the side. You can click on the chat icon at the bottom and put it in, and Alexandra will make sure that I get them and I can ask JL. So you start off the book with a note about self-care. Can you tell me why you did that?
Yeah, it was funny. I was just looking at that today. Someone had posted about it. And it's interesting because I think a couple of things that are important about that is I was finishing this book in 2020, and I was actually wrapping up the final edits of the book this time last year. And this time last year, we had witnessed Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and then there was this uprising of just like the civil rights movement times 2, you know?
Yeah.
And so I was writing this book about race and racism at that time. And I wrote it a dystopia because I didn't want to be so caught in like the real hardships of the specifics of today. And yet there's no way to avoid it, right? Even when you're writing a dystopia and life is happening. And so I was feeling a lot of like sadness over writing something that was dealing with hard things during such a hard time. And so I wanted people to come to the book knowing that while I don't consider the book to be sad or, devastating, as some people say, I think it's important to know that sad and devastating things do happen in the book and that people should know that. And sometimes people do trigger warnings and they sort of say, this is going to happen, beware. And it wasn't so much that I felt the need to tell people what was going to happen. I just felt the need to remind them that it's about injustice. And when injustice happens, people respond in different ways, and readers have to respond in whatever ways work for them. And the last thing I'll say about it is I remember when the book first came out, a woman randomly came across that post and posted to her friends, like, hey, my mom is really sick. I found this book. It has this warning. Should I read it? And I actually wrote back to her and said, I don't know. Like, you're going to have to figure out if this is a good time. But I think uh, uh, books aren't always, you're not always ready for a book right when you buy it or right when you see it. Sometimes you buy it or you get it, and it's a year later before you pick it up. And that's really when you should read it. So I just sort of told her, like, there's no pressure from me for sure. But also, like, read it when you feel like you're ready, because that warning's there for a reason.
And that you can pick the book up and you can put it down and you can think
Yes.
about it and come back to it and digest, because there's a lot to
Yes.
digest in this book.
Yes. And that's important too, right? That how you read it as much as like when you read it. And
Mhm.
the willingness to just say, like, you don't, a lot of people read it in a day or two, which is a lot. I feel like my sister and brother both were like, I read it in less than 24 hours. And I was like, I did not write it in 24 hours. So take your time.
Which begs the question, how long have you been working on this book? I mean, it's your first book of fiction, but I can't imagine it's been anything but years that it's been gestating.
It was 8 years of writing. I started writing it as soon as I finished the memoir about my dad, because I just had these big questions about life and about systems of injustice, how they start, how people react to them, when people realize they're living under a system of injustice, and how do they respond to it. I just had all these big questions after learning about my dad's life growing up in the 50s and 60s in America. And so it started there, but I definitely didn't know what I was doing. So it took me like 4 years to even figure out, like, okay, I'm writing a dystopia. These are kind of the rules of the world. These are kind of the lay of the land. And then the last 4 years was when I was really like committed to the idea, understood what it was, and was like really doing the fine tuning work, I think.
Mhm. Now,
Mhm.
did you know from the outset that it was going to be a dystopian narrative? I mean, why choose that form of storytelling as opposed to any other?
I did. I mean, I think it was partly because after working on the memoir, I had done so much research and everything was so literal in a memoir, right?
Yes.
I had to like go to my dad's hometowns and see where he lived and then document it and then do these interviews and transcribe them. And there was so many rules and like facts to really put into the memoir. And so I thought a dystopia to me felt like the exact opposite of memoir and nonfiction. I could literally make up anything. I could make up the name of the world, of course, but I could make up every rule. They could live upside down if I wanted to, right? So dystopia felt like the most freeing way to approach the topic. And I think also I realized, probably more so like when I got to the later stages and even talking about the book, dystopia allowed me to talk about race in a way that I couldn't if I was dealing with real life. Because for the Black community, which is what I was very much thinking about, we're spread out all over the world with all
Mhm.
kinds of different nationalities and countries and languages. And of course, those some of the issues we face differ based on where we live and what kind of role we have in our country. I remember my mother-in-law is from the Caribbean and saying she didn't realize she was Black until she came to Canada, because in St. Vincent everyone is Black, right? So there wasn't this like us versus them versus it was so different. And so I felt like dystopia allowed me to pull the common elements in the Black community together and discuss them and unpack them and think about them in a way that I couldn't if I said it in Canada and was dealing with the Black community in Canada. It would be very different from Black communities elsewhere. So dystopia was a really freeing way to look at systemic racism and to think about injustice.
It's interesting too because I mean it is an entire world that you
Hmm.
build, but it's a very familiar world at the
Hmm.
same time. I mean, the biggest city is Cape Town, which is,
Yeah.
Cape Town,
Yeah.
refers to that. how do you approach building such a world,
Mm.
with the details and making it believable? Because even if you're writing dystopia, it has to be
Yeah.
truthful and believable within the structure of the book, right?
Hmm. I mean, dystopia is hard. It's both freeing on one hand. That's why I started. I was like, yes, this is gonna be great. It's gonna be so freeing. And then it's really hard because every idea you have opens up 20 more, 30 more questions. One of the things are the scars that you heard about in that opening chapter.
Yeah.
And so that was really from the beginning, two things that I knew were going to happen is that they were going to have these scars. Gutter children were going to have these scars. And they were also what you find out in the early first chapters is that there's going to be a debt assigned to each child. And so, of course, those ideas seemed brilliant and great. And I was so excited. I was like, yes, this is good. And then it was like, okay, but how much and when? And what are the rules? What if they do this? What if they do that? What if someone comes from here? And I was like, oh gosh, oh my gosh. And so I think the real challenge with a dystopia is figuring out what your must-haves are, what the core, like this is the central element of this world, and
Mhm.
then establishing all the rules. And one of the big questions everybody asks is why is it like this, right? I started with the scars and the debt, and then I had to figure out what the backstory was, why we got to this point. And so figure out why you got there. And then, of course, I was trying to write the book to figure out how to get out of it.
Mhm.
And I won't spoil how that goes, but that was also really hard. And so, yeah, that's how you do that. Like, what would I would recommend to somebody who's writing a dystopia? Is I would definitely recommend spending a lot of time planning and plotting, like really thinking about everything about the world before you write a single chapter. I think that's what took me the longest is I just started writing thinking like it would just figure its way out and it didn't. And then when I had to sort of superimpose those rules in afterwards, it was much more difficult. So I would say, yeah, figure some of that stuff out early.
Now, there's also the idea of voice as well. I mean, the
Mm.
language is accessible and it
Yeah.
reads very much like a young adult novel, but it's not a young adult novel.
Yeah.
What audience were you aiming for, and how did you choose the sort of the language level and the voice that you had?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think the young adult question is one that comes up a lot. And what I'll say is when I was writing the story, the question for me is what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? That was
Mhm.
like the initial question. What do you do about it? Like when do you figure it out and then what do you do about it? And for me, I felt like 14 was around the time that you would start to see that the world is sucky and you would start to look around and be like, whoa, whoa. And it's going to be over the 14 to 18, 20, where you start to say like, oh my gosh, why is it like this?
Yeah.
Or what am I going to do about it? At least, I mean, and maybe that's just because that's how it was for me. I was quite ignorant about the world up until about 14. And then I started to be like, what in the what is going on here? And increasingly so as I moved through my teen years. So the voice for me was was a necessity. It was the requirement of the story was that I wanted the reader to be uncovering this world at the same time as the main character. And so I told it in first person present tense with a 14-year-old because I felt like that was the most realistic way to navigate the world. The reader doesn't know anything before Alamina knows it. And there's a couple of stories that Alamina shares about her past, but mostly doing it in a way where she's trying to figure out what it means to the present, right? Where it's happened to her and she's like, oh, wait, she's not bringing in extra information for the reader. She's putting it together with the reader. And so that was the critical point for me in writing the story. And then the question became for my editors and for my publishers, like, how are we going to label this?
Mhm.
What section of the bookstore are we going to put this in? And that was a question for them to explore. Of course, they did ask. And at the end of the day, I mean, your question was really great about who was I sort of aiming? I wanted everybody to read it. And so, probably the biggest deciding factor in labeling it young adult or not was that, young adults, teens will read up, but adults don't read down as
Yeah.
often. So if you
Yeah.
label something young adult, adults won't read it. But if you label it adult, teens will still read it. And so that was the ultimate reason why I sort of leaned into the not putting it in the young adult teen category. And I remember reading a book by Nicola Yoon, who her books are labeled young adult.
Yeah.
And I remember going into the teen section and seeing her book there. And I guess I just didn't feel like that was the section that I would want the book to be found in.
Hmm. Well,
And so that was me.
it focuses the audience as opposed to broadening it out, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's the thing. Yeah. Now Elamina Dubois
Mm.
is the main character, and
Yeah.
like her fellow students at the academy, she's looking to earn something called redemption freedom, which is a bit of a fascinating term. Can you
Mm.
talk about the concept of redemption freedom and why you used it in the book?
Yeah. So redemption freedom is sort of when I mentioned that everybody or all the gutter children in the book are assigned a debt. And so redemption freedom is what happens when that debt is paid off. And this concept of redemption freedom was one that was, again, with me from the beginning because it was tied to the debt. I had to come up with a name for it. And I loved this. Well, I loved in an evil way. I loved this. It's not good. I loved this idea of people being asked to work and earn their freedom and their kind of like national respect. The big line that's used is um, oh, from the gutter to greatness for the greatness of the country. And the idea that like people have to work and prove themselves by paying off this debt to prove that they're worthy of freedom. And to me, of course, I think there's a lot of connections to real life and to the
Absolutely.
way racism plays itself out. There's this sense that, I grew up middle class in a suburban neighborhood, and I had a lot of white friends. And so I had a lot of privilege. But I also still felt this pressure to prove that I was a good Black person. I was the good kind of Black person. I remember I would listen to the news, and whenever I heard that it was a Black person, I felt personally like ashamed, like I needed to apologize to people because they had failed. And, I just felt this constant need to be like good in the bad way, in the sense of just earning that kind of approval from people, because I knew what people thought of Black folks, and I didn't want to be associated. I tell people this often. When I was about 14, I didn't know if I wanted to be Black. I definitely didn't want to be called Black. And I was definitely unsure about whether I wanted to be associated with the Black community. And I say that like with great shame, but it's because I did not have a lot of Black role models around me. Um, I did not have, like, I didn't understand. My parents are both only children and they both moved to Canada away from their parents. And so I was not around a lot of Black people a lot at all. And when I was, I felt really uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I met my husband, and he has a huge family, lots of aunts, uncles, and cousins, that I really started to investigate deeply, like some of these questions and problems, concerns. When I started to see the joy, the blessing, the benefit, the real richness of being a part of the Black community. And then I started to interrogate the kinds of things I had been told and where I had heard those things and why I believed those things. And so redemption freedom for me was a way of discussing and unpacking that, because Elamina has to pay off her debt. She has to earn her way out. And that becomes a real interesting question because there's 4 other young people that she's connected with early in the book, and they all approach redemption freedom very differently and all have different things happen to them. And so it, for me, was about showing the complexity of the issue and not just this like, I should hate myself and my community all my life, which of course is not ideal. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that. Actually, I
Mhm.
didn't know that, and I'm sorry to
Mm.
hear that. I
Yeah, I think
suppose.
yeah, well, sorry, just to add to that, I think there's an inherent kind of thing that you grow up believing in the Black community that you're second class citizens. And I think if you're from a country outside of Canada, it can be even more so. For me, I was from Canada, my parents were from the States. There wasn't a sense that my country was second class or second rate, just me as a Black person and just the Black community in general. And but for a lot of people, there's that connection. And there's also the sense that like the country that they're from is not as good, as deserving as the country that we're in. And so, part of the story is of people, like I know a lot of people from the Caribbean, from African countries who send their kids, who send their families to Canada for a better education, a better life, in which they're then taught, their African country is not as valued or valuable to the world as Canada is. And they're taught to sort of like be ashamed of where they're from. And so that, yeah, all of that.
It's interesting because I mean the world that's created. I mean, there's hierarchy within
Yeah.
it. I mean, it's not a homogenous world,
Yeah.
as the way the Black experience isn't homogenous. There's all different layers and intersections and the rest of it. And in the book, there's the gutter and the mainland and the
Mhm.
hill. Um, why did you decide to put those together? I mean, was it just a way, not just a way, but a way of exploring the differences, and there's class centers into it.
Yeah.
People aren't always good to each other,
Mhm.
it's the whole realm of human experience,
Yeah.
in all of those different sort of places.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Yeah. The different places are really important because I think, as I was saying, in terms of like what we end up believing about the places we're from, becomes really important about how we see ourselves in the world. And, whenever I go to high schools, I tell young people, do not be ashamed of the places that you're from. Do not let anyone tell you that the places you're from are any less valuable, worthwhile, beautiful, rich, as the place that you're in or the places you may go. And I think that's really important. And the gutter, hit the hill, and the mainland become really important spaces to talk together, all three of them together, because like you said, it brings up the conversation of class, which I think is really important to unpack as well, that this isn't just about when we're talking about the Black community, isn't just about a group of people who don't have money trying to fight to have more money. It's also about people who have money in the Black community questioning like how they spend it, what they do with it, how are they meant to live. Um, there's a lot of criticism about that within the Black community and outside the Black community, and it's really complicated. And so I wanted to create the hill in relationship to the gutter and the mainland to address some of that complication, which I think is really important. And I also felt like I wanted the gutter to be called the gutter, to be given a negative name by the people, to speak to the ways colonization damages and destroys communities. Um, One of the reasons I hated being called Black when I was growing up is because I'm a church kid. Been to church all my life, a person of faith, and I would go and I would sing these songs about Black being sin and Black being evil, and then I would have to call myself Black, and I was like, but I'm not bad and I'm not evil. Like I just had these really difficult, and I should also say, in addition to hearing that Black is sin and Black is evil, I was also hearing white is pure, white is wonderful, white is like what you want to aspire to, wash me whiter than snow, like it was these things that were entrenched in the two places I was living the most, my church community and my home. And I couldn't reconcile the two. And so the gutter is called the gutter because um, mainlanders give it that name. And then they call the people who are from it gutter. And I wanted to sort of speak to that way in which labels and names become part of how we see ourselves and part of how we're viewed in the world. Black is positive, it's being affirmed, but it's also used in negative ways still. And so it is impossible to escape that connotation that whiteness is good and Blackness is bad, and then that we have these groups of people, one that's called white and one that's called Black, and the power dynamics between the two. And I never use white and Black in the book, mainlanders are not called white, gutter folks and Soci people are not called black, and that's intentional. I remember the first time I did a school visit and
Mhm.
the teacher referred to them as white or black, and I was just like, oh my gosh. And suddenly I realized the problem with using those words to talk about the characters is it, even in just using those words verbally, it gave power to some of the characters and took power away from some of the other characters in a way that I didn't want. And so I was very clear. We have a teacher's guide that I posted on my website,
Yeah.
and that's sort of written in there to describe, like, don't use these terms because it can actually be damaging for the students to have to talk about them in this way. Um, to use those terms. I mean, it's still hard for me to hear it like that.
That's astonishing because it's,
Hmm.
I mean, it doesn't sound as if she actually took away from the book what she should have taken away from the book. And you think, how can you read that like that?
But I think people are, I mean, when you interpret it, when you go in, you
Mhm.
think like this speaks to the white community, this speaks about whiteness and blackness, like you can definitely have that conversation. But to call a character white and black in the book, yeah,
Mhm.
I did have to say in a couple of places to people, like, they're not white, they're not black.
No.
And not because that's not the color of their skin, but just because that's not the names, the titles that I want associated with them.
Mhm. Um, Now the gutter children, as you
Mhm,
mentioned, were literally scarred at birth
mhm,
with the X's on their hands. I mean, that's generational trauma right
mhm,
there,
mhm.
written literally on their hands. Is that what you were getting at there with the X's?
Yeah, I wanted two things. With the X's and the debt, I wanted one piece that was visual, that like when they arrived in a space, it would identify them as being a part of a community. And then I wanted the debt because I wanted something internal, something people couldn't see, but that they
Yeah.
would carry with them. And I think those two things really speak to some of the challenges of racism and systemic racism. There are things that we bring into a room where visibly it affects the way people respond to us, the way people talk about us, the way people engage with us. But there are also ways in which we carry pain, we carry debt, we carry trauma inside that people can't see. And so that's also the difference between, the hill and gutter folks, is that you some don't have scars, right? There you do come across, Alameda only has one. They do come
Yeah.
across characters that have none. And so like, is it different for them? Is life different? For sure. But to still have those debts or those legacies in their history is also an important part to unpack as well.
Yes. Now the people on the hill,
Hmm.
they're the rich ones.
Hmm.
Um, they're culpable in so many in so many ways. Which talks about the nuance to all of this. They are looking down on, the people in the gutter. They've reached economic
Hmm.
independence,
Hmm.
but they're not doing anything for the broader community. Is there judgment there, or what's the nuance there?
Well, one thing with all of the characters in the book, I feel like at some point you're going to, well, I hope, with all the gutter characters and the Soci people in the book, I feel like at some point you're going to be really angry with them. And at some points you're going to be really happy with them. So there's no character in which I think you'll walk away being like, everything they did was amazing.
Yeah.
The characters are complicated. And I encourage those of you who haven't read it, as you read it, I think it's really exciting for me to have you think about the moments where you're really like, yes, do that. Go, Alameda, well done. And other moments where you're like, no, don't do that. I think
Yeah.
it's really, really important with each of the characters to ask yourself why, what's behind your own feelings. Because to be honest, there were moments in the book where I was like, I did not realize she was going to do that until the last minute, to be honest. And I don't
Mhm.
know how I feel about it. And that came from like things I had read and lived and stories that I had come across. And so that's just in general. And I think, what I'll say about the Hill people without spoiling too much is I encourage you to all the way through just ask yourself what's good and what's bad. When you're in a situation where you're like, they are bad people, I will say this. I don't think any of the Soci and gutter characters are bad. So if you think they're bad, I think I would encourage you to look deeper and think about what might be bringing you to that experience. Some of the mainlanders are like just pure bad. Like you don't have to look for good in all of them. Although I
Mhm.
do try and like have some redeeming qualities for them, because I think even people who are doing evil believe they're doing good. And it was really important for me, even with some of the mainlander characters where you're like, okay, that's not right. It's that they had to believe that they were doing a good thing, that it was the right choice. And so they're not all bad, but it's harder, I think, with them. But I would say with the soci characters for sure, and the gutter characters, like, and the characters from the hill, um, don't let anybody be all evil, because for me, they none of them were all evil. It was really about showing the complexity of privilege, the complexity of systemic racism, and how it works and how it's designed not just to tear a group down, but to
Mhm.
tear it apart from one another. Like that's probably, I remember when I was working on my dad's book and they were talking about the history of slavery in the US, and what they said is slavery in the US is one of um, the worst examples of kind of like racial trauma, in that it wasn't just about pushing people down, it was about separating them from each other. So
Yeah.
taking mothers and fathers apart, taking children from families, taking just splitting the family up over and over and over again, separating them, um, not just tribe against tribe, but like literally breaking the family unit apart piece by piece. And it's impossible to look at um, children's aid and the problems with the police as anything but a continuation of that kind of devastation, and something we've never really addressed. We've never really said, like, this is what we did, how do we fix it? We've just kind of tried to police it in different ways.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I think the different characters, I think it's really important to think about that.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have come in, and then we'll go back to more
Mm,
conversation. Sort of talking about the research and the
mm,
details. Janice asked, I said, I think in a dystopian setting, there's always a temptation to try to figure out the parallels to the real world,
mhm.
which there are in this case. Can you
Yeah.
comment on some of the real things in history that you do from, such as colonial explorers, apartheid,
Mhm.
residential schools, and that
Yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah. I think for me, a lot of people have been able to make the really good connections between some of the maybe more well known historical moments.
Hmm.
Certainly, apartheid was definitely something I was thinking about. And it wasn't so much residential schools, to be honest, that I was thinking about. I was thinking more about how colonization affects countries, just in
Yeah.
general. And you see it in African countries as well, and other countries as well. But just the way in which schools are set up, and international, even now, international schools as being this ideal setting, and the
Yeah.
ways that kids are taught to go to an international school where they learn, British law or American law or British history, American history, and then they're not taught any of their own culture and community because it's considered to be not as good, not as strong. They study Shakespeare. They said, well, I'm really opposed to studying Shakespeare in school, so I won't get into that here. But these are the kinds these are the kinds of things that it sort of perpetuates, this idea that British colonizing white stories are the best stories, the best way to tell stories. And it's reinforced. My father-in-law truly believes that everything British is better, and he's so deeply invested in it sometimes. And I just have to say, there it's because it happens from the very beginning. And it's because we're taught that the artists from our home countries, home communities, are not as strong, not as good, not as talented, not as memorable. And I don't totally remember what the question was, but oh, yes.
It
So
was
specific moments in history. Yes. So one last thing I'll say about that is I was also thinking very much about the present day problems in school settings as well, and the present day problems of
yeah,
colonization. So, for example, right now, I was mentioning, a lot of young, like, I have a teen who lives with us in his own apartment, but who was sent here when he was 16 to live with a father he had never met, and who dad kicked him out, didn't know him, didn't like living with him, so kicked him out. And he was literally homeless at 16 because everybody thought this was going to be a better place for him to live and a better place for him to grow up. Fine. But nobody was here to catch him when that fell apart. There was no system that was there to give him a home, to give him a new family, to give him a new setting. And so and he was thrown into a school system that again kind of like bounced him around. When he was in COVID, nobody was checking on him. And so it's these kinds of things that, when you're looking at the book, and especially at Livingstone Academy, when they're trying to think about like, where do they go from here? They're gutter children. They've been sent to this academy. They're meant to go out in the world, but in what ways are they prepared and not prepared for real life? And in what ways are they being told already that they're second class citizens? And how is that going to affect the way that they navigate the world? And so I think that a lot of the things, what I would say is the real, like, for the keeners out there who are reading the book, if you want some like A pluses, think about contemporary examples of what's happening in the book and contemporary ways, because I was very much probably more invested in probably like 60s plus moments and experiences in particular, but definitely present day.
Now, it's interesting because, you're talking about school and Shakespeare, but, it's a school system where To Kill a Mockingbird is still the book that so many teachers use.
Deb, my nephew is in summer school right now and came home with his school list, and he is doing Hamlet and Brave New World. Do you know what I did in grade 12? Hamlet and Brave New World. And I am not a young spring chicken. It's not, it was a while ago.
And there's a distinct lack of imagination. But, is that what Gutter Child you were sort of hoping would happen as well, that it might take the place of To Kill a Mockingbird, or at least update people's ideas of what it is to talk about race relations and racism and all of that?
For sure. I mean, there are a couple of schools that have done the book already. The book came out in January. So to do it already, I'm just wildly impressed that happened.
Yeah.
And the conversations that the students have had are incredible. Like the questions that they've asked me, even the teacher's guide, when the teachers who wrote the teacher's guide and worked on it, when they gave it to me, I started crying because I was like, imagine being in class and being told like, okay, for this book, look up Langston Hughes or research W.E.B. Du Bois, who's quoted at the front of the book. Like for me, I did not read a Black author until university, and it was life-changing. And I had to pay thousands of dollars for that life-changing moment. And so I just think, how lovely would it be to have had those moments so much younger, and to be able to shape a better understanding of myself and my community from a much earlier age. Because you can't deny that the things I've told you about how I felt about being Black are definitely connected to what I was watching on TV and reading on my own. I love books. So to have kids be able to see something where they're being invited to question those things so early is just like beyond me. I did a school group event maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was all hosted by the kids. The teachers were literally like, I did not hear from the teachers the whole time.
Amazing.
One of the kids hosted, the other kids all asked questions. Sometimes they were talking to each other, and I was just like, oh, interesting. And it was just, I would love to see, I'm not going to say that doesn't happen when you read To Kill a Mockingbird,
but it's nice to at least have something new out there. Now, you mentioned Langston Hughes, and I mean the Blue Book of Poetry is referred to throughout the novel. Can you talk about the role of poetry and the role of Hughes in particular for you?
Yeah, one of the things that I had to think about when I was thinking about this system and what happens when you grow up in a system that fails you, and what do you do about it? When do you know about it? One of the big questions for me was, how do you find out about it, and how do you unpack it? What's the source that gets you thinking and wrestling with it, especially at a school like Livingstone Academy? And the idea for me, I remember someone saying that poetry has a unique capacity to change the world. And I was like, really? I don't even like that much poetry. How does that work? But I realized, when we talk about music, when we talk about poetry, the interesting thing about them is they're so widely consumable that everybody can consume a single song really quickly, more than any other kind of form of art, perhaps. In people could argue like visual art, but I think in terms of like text, definitely a poem is the way to get everybody quickly talking about one thing at the same
Amanda
time.
Gorman, right?
Yes, perfect example. And so I had this idea of like what kind of poetry would a 14-year-old come across that would get them to think about the problems that are around them that they may not see but they're kind of starting to feel. And Langston Hughes for me was perfect because his poetry is so accessible. It's both kind of coded. There's messages in it, but there's also very clearly speaking about things. You think about, I always call it Raisin in the Sun, which is not the title of the poem, but I call it that anyways. I think it's called A Dream Deferred. And it's like, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up or does it explode? I'm skipping some words, but the idea like that you're thinking about a deferred dream and you're thinking about an explosion and about drying up and the comparison between the two. I think at such an early age, you can talk about that in a way that has 5 14-year-olds, 15 16-year-olds thinking about it differently and
Mhm.
thinking about how they would react to that. How do you feel about dreams? What happens to your dreams? Do you think your dreams are possible? What do you do if you think they're impossible? That one poem can get a group of teens thinking. And that's what the Blue Book of Poetry was about. It was a way for Elamina. It becomes a way for Elamina to think about the world. And you see throughout, it comes back to her to be
Mhm.
able to think about it.
Now, Heather here has asked, what grade were the kids when you were talking
Mm.
about the kids that were, yeah.
So though that group of kids, most of the groups that I've talked to, interestingly enough, have been grade 8s and 9s.
Mhm.
And I will say this: I think grade 8 is too young, but personally, I think it's too young. When I did the book clubs with them,
Mhm.
they got it. Like the grade 8s got most of it. They got talking about the right things. The area where I was like, maybe I was wrong. Maybe like grade 8s can read it. The one area where I remember thinking, this is where you're not ready yet, is they asked about one character who had some mental health issues. And I won't expose who it is or what happens, but there's some very clear advanced problems.
Yeah.
And I wasn't, even as I explained to them in more simple terms, I could tell that some of them didn't quite get it. And I
Yeah.
knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that within a year or two, they would know exactly what that character was going through and why, in a way that they
Mhm.
just couldn't quite process yet.
Yeah. Another question is from Bill. Are all the characters based on real persons?
Hmm. Um, they're all based on real people, but it's also like a combination of people. So, for example, Elamina's adopted, and so there's a conversation about how her adoption has affected her view of the world and her view of herself as a gutter child. And when I was growing up, I had two best friends. And my one best friend was a Black girl who was adopted from Haiti by a white family. And my other best friend is a white girl who adopted her son from Rwanda. And so I was exposed to conversations about transracial adoption pretty regularly as teens and also like into adulthood. And so Elamina's story is kind of like a meshing of some parts of my life and story, some parts of my friend's story, and some parts. So usually I'm like, I think the thing about fiction that's so great is you're not stuck with one person. I don't have to write this story as like my best friend Judy and take all the pieces of her life. I can just
That's
take the
right.
little pieces that I want and
The
then I can
great
take
thing about
pieces of
fiction.
somebody else. It's a great thing. You get to assemble people from all the people that you've ever met. And so
Mhm.
very few characters are like one person. I would say, David was like very much inspired by my dad and my dad's story, but also has pieces of my husband. Don't tell
Mm.
him. And so yeah, it's basically each character I think is a bit of multiple people that I know or that I've read
Mhm.
about.
One thing I found interesting about the book, especially since, there's a lot of younger people in it, was the lack of technology.
Hmm.
Why was there no, especially
Yeah,
since sort of dystopia, you think,
yeah.
future, what why no technology? It was great, no devices.
So yeah, so I guess with the dystopia, you kind of have two choices. You can write like future into the future, or you can write alternate history.
Yeah.
And for me, Gutter Child was very much kind of an alternate history approach. I actually nowhere in the book does it say when it's set. There's no time. You don't know if it's 10 years from now or 50 years ago or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, but I think for me, I had to root it somewhere. Um, and I had to make rules about technology, for example. And so I decided that in my head, it was very much set in the 50s, 60s. And so that
Okay.
technology piece was not there because that's just not what was available at the time. And that helped me, when we go back to the question you asked about building a dystopia and a
Yeah.
world, it helped me build a world that I felt was more honest because I stuck with sort of like the there are dystopian rules. Obviously, scarring and death are not actually a part of life, but it helped me to sort of say, okay, what kinds of cups? I remember there's a scene, a medical scene, and I was like, oh shoot, what do I do here? Like what kinds of tools do they have and what do they look like? And so I just said, okay, let's look up what the tools in 1950s look like,
Yeah.
1960s, and I'll just use that as a launch pad. And again, like fiction, I could change whatever I wanted. But that was sort of my starting point.
Hmm. Now, Heather says, as you speak about your process integrating your own lived experience into the product of the book, I'm inspired by your voice and the rich complexity. I find myself wanting to learn more, how to learn more, and to be a voice as an ally.
Mm. Oh, so the question is how to do that.
I
Oh,
think so. It was a comment, but yeah, it's pretty easy to turn that into that question. Absolutely.
well, I'm going to say this because it's a faith-based group. Um, I think it's been really important for me to find the intersection of faith and social justice. And I wouldn't say this to other groups. So if there are people who are not like faith-based folks, I'm sorry, but like this is what I'll say to you guys. Um, yeah, I think honestly, the place where I have learned the most about social justice has been studying Jesus' life and studying the way that he lived and the way that he interacted with people and who he paid attention to and how he treated those people, how he made friends, how he built connections. For me, that has made the difference in my personal life the most. And that's the starting point, I think, for me. That's the place where it begins. And I think from there, the question is the really hard one is, who have you been overlooking? Whose pain, injustice, and difficulties have you sort of, um, and I'll say this for me, I learned from the church some really bad ways to treat people, really bad ways to treat the queer community my whole life. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I was like, what the F are we doing here, guys? This is not right.
Yeah.
And so for me, I would just say that's the starting place for this group. That's what I would leave with you is to start there, to start looking at what you've learned that might be harmful, what you've been watching and what you've been reading that might tell you that a certain group is not as civilized, as not as skilled, as not as talented. And then I would say to actively look at what you watch and what you read and to ask yourself who's missing, whose stories are you not consuming? And it's probably because I'll give an example. Some people are like, I really love thrillers. I really love romance. And so you've read a lot of white women romance novels and a lot of white dude thrillers. And that allows you to like sort of contribute economically to one particular group of people, but it also continues to reinforce the absence of a lot of people in those stories. And so it's about saying, okay, I have spent a lifetime reading white women romance novels. I'm going to read some black women romance novels, or I'm going to read some, and don't torture yourself by reading books that aren't good or aren't in the place that you want to be, but like work hard to find things that fill the gaps in your reading life. I remember reading a book by a trans writer. I realized that I had not read a book by a trans writer. I read a book about trans people, but not by a trans writer. And
Yeah.
the first book I read was Casey Plett's Little Fish.
Yeah.
And I struggled at the beginning because of all the things I had learned and been told and what I hadn't read before. And when I pushed through, I wept. I wept through the last like 3 chapters because I was just like, imagine missing this story because I had listened to ways of thinking that were so archaic and gone behind. And so yeah, I guess there's not a book that I would recommend in terms of like everybody should read this book, because I think some people learn from fiction. That's where I learn
Mhm.
the most, and some people learn from nonfiction. But I would say, as people of faith, start with Jesus' life and what he did and how he lived, because I think that should inspire you to look at the people who are most oppressed. Like think about the people who are most oppressed, or the people that you're most likely to avoid walking down the street, in friendships, etc. It could be people who are poor. It could be people who are trans or queer or black queer, or it could be, and read books by those people. Buy their books and read them. And I would say, like, really work through that through supporting their
Mhm.
careers and reading their stories.
And working through your own assumptions as well, not putting something down, but working through your own
Yes.
assumptions, because it's about internal growth as well, right? I mean, it's about changing yourself,
Yeah.
and you have to be prepared to change.
And it takes time. I think
Mhm.
that's the other thing, is that we want sometimes to be better tomorrow, to
Yeah.
be right about things and better about things next week. And it will take years. I mean, it's taken me years to come to terms with what it means to be a Christian and what it means to support communities that I was told were not as good or not worthwhile, whatever. It's
Yeah.
taking me a while to not only unpack it in my mind, but also be able to truly connect and make amends in some cases. Um, and I also just think one of the things I love about books is that they allow you that time and space to
Mhm.
read something. I remember when I was reading Little Fish and I read the opening chapter and I was like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do with this? And then I'd be like, what is wrong with you? Because there's a couple curse words because people are having sex. Get over it. I was like, okay. And chapter 2, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's happening again. It's like, and it was me talking to myself through this book and realizing, like, honestly, chill out. It's a book. Like, and then starting to unpack, like, why do I think that way? Why do I believe that? It took me the whole book to begin to really recognize my own faults and my own and one of the things that was actually, I remember when I was reading the book thinking, Casey Platt would read a book about my life and my faith and never judge me for who I am, what I do, where I go. And here I am questioning things that I shouldn't question. And yeah, books are powerful that way.
It's another question is, do you, and I think this gets into, the conversation right now is, suggestions on how to have open and safe conversations,
Hmm.
and to give others space to speak and
Hmm.
honor the complexity. I mean, it's the same approach as reading the books and reacting to the books, isn't it, in some
Yeah.
ways?
I mean, if you can find a group of people that you can talk about with this stuff and be really honest and say, like, I don't know how to think about this. Like, I genuinely do not know. You know, I grew up, like, I've talked to people who grew up white during in South Africa and being like, I grew up hearing like they were terrible people, that Africans were, and you have to be able to put those words out honestly,
Yeah.
and you have to find safe places to do that. I recommend, before you get there, like I said, read a lot, listen to podcasts, listen to conversations, again, podcasts led by the people who've lived that stuff as well, not
Mhm.
people interpreting that. I think it's really important to listen to the voices of those who have come from those experiences. And then when you start to build the language, try it out with friends in safe spaces before you go out to like parties with random people and start saying, yeah, this is what I learned when I read this book.
Yeah.
That's really not cool. Don't do that.
That's funny. It'll get you into all sorts of trouble.
It will, but it'll also just, people will be like, no, not you. They will just walk away from you.
Well, Jill, thanks so much
Hmm.
for the conversation and for the book. I don't know if Alexandra or Janice or anyone else wants to hop in, whether there's anything we haven't talked about that somebody might want to hear about, but it's or if there's anything else you want to say. It's been sort of
Mm,
great and wide ranging and illuminating, I think.
thank you. Thank you. I have to say, talking to faith-based communities is probably one of my favorites when it comes to the book because I went through such a difficult faith moment. I had been a part of a church for a really long time. And as I was working through the book, I just realized like I could not put up with what was happening anymore. And I spoke out about it and it didn't go well. And I had to leave that church. And so in the book, there's some of it gets a little bit used. You know, Bill asked that question about characters. Sometimes moments
Mhm.
in my life also become part of the novel. But I really like talking to faith-based communities because I think there's something special when you can be really honest and fully open about your whole self, you know. And sometimes if it's not a faith-based community, I do not generally preach about Jesus, but but when it is, I do, and that's nice. That's fun.
That's sorry, Alexandra, were you can say
Oh no,
something?
I was just going to say, well, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm.
Did you have something else you wanted to say, Deborah?
No, I
Okay.
was good. It's the thought has flown out of my
Oh,
mind as they tend to do.
well,
It's
we're
like, oh, I've
so.
got something great, but yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Um, well, we're so glad that you spoke to us
Mm.
today, and we're very very grateful, and so glad that you did also speak about the aspect of faith
Mm.
to come and talk to us about that relation and your relationship with Jesus has been really
Mm.
wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you for the wonderful encouragement and advice, and for this fascinating glimpse into your process. This has been an absolutely tremendous introduction to the novel, and I'm so looking forward to reading the rest of it and to gathering again in mid-August to discuss it with the group. Um,
Mm.
It'll
thank
be
you
a lot of fun.
both so
You're
much.
welcome to come back, JL. And if
For
not,
sure.
that's
Sure.
fine too. But
Yeah.
yeah,
All right.
whatever
Well,
works.
thanks for having me. Thanks
Thank
for
you
having
so
me.
much.
It's really
And
nice.
it's a St. Olave's tradition to end meetings
Thank you.
with the grace.
Mm.
So perhaps we would say the grace together.
Awesome.
The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ,
Mm.
and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you both so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone. Thanks, JL. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.